The Ukrainian lines have buckled in the center part of the zone, and there is a risk that the Ukrainian army could break in the middle part. And the question is, can Russia operationally exploit this, or is things going to continue to go along at a slower pace? To try and untangle some of these things and a lot of other developments that you might not have seen lately, we have our go-to expert, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, combat veteran, highly decorated combat veteran, and great friend of the show. Doug, welcome back.
Thanks.
Well, listen, let's just jump right into it here. There has been a number of places along the front line picking up with some speed after Ukraine lost Avdiivka a few weeks back. The Russians have not slowed down at all. In fact, they've been picking up. If the first part of the post-offensive from 2023 that Ukraine failed in, and Russia really started moving forward, but it was kind of inching forward, really all along the line. They had constant pressure, but their advances were literally measured in meters and hundreds of meters sometimes. Now, all of a sudden, there's starting to be more and more movement forward, where in recent days, they've moved forward by 1 kilometer, or in a couple of places, 2 kilometers in a single day, and they're taking more and more area. Now, as Alex, who's also a frequent guest on our show, had on his video yesterday, he showed what the operational picture is, and it's not looking good for Ukraine. Check this out.
From an operational perspective, Ukraine has lost the initiative. The latest breakthrough opened up a lot of possibilities for the Russian command. In my opinion, the logical objective could be Kostiantynivka, with a pincer maneuver with an attack from the east. Thus, the importance of the Battle of Chasiv Yar, since it's the last major urban area before Kostiantynivka. This would be coupled with an attack from the south. The Russian troops in Ocheretine could push north and cut the TO-504 road linking Pokrovsk with Kostiantynivka, possibly at this crossroad right here, 10 kilometers away from their current positions. Then they could conquer the area between the H-20 highway and the TO-504 road. This would allow the Russian army to encircle Kostiantynivka and force its defenders between an early pullout or last stand.
Now, Doug, what do you consider this? Because really, compared to any portion of this war, this is the fastest we've been seeing the Russian side moving there. And the question I have right now is, what do you think the issues are regarding whether this even if this operational push here is something that's going to be temporary, or is there a possibility that the Ukraine army could break? And what might that look like?
I think that the attacks we're witnessing on the Russian side are still designed to largely shape the battlefield for the larger offensives to come. So what you're seeing with those arrows is accurate, but it's not exclusively in those areas. All along the line, the Russians are advancing, but there's no point in advancing in depth unless you're capturing something of value, and that's what Alex showed you in the diagram. They want to break up these lines of communication, resupply, call them whatever you will. And at the same time, they're positioning more and more forces for deep operations. And I think that's going to happen in the near future to the north near Kharkov. They've concentrated about 100,000 troops, and I think it's pretty obvious that's where they're headed. So there are going to be a number of offensive operations. And in the meantime, as you point out, large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers are doing one of two things. They're either refusing to fight and withdrawing in front of the Russians, or they're surrendering. And if you have a lot of casualties that you cannot evacuate, the smart move is to surrender to the Russians, because you know your soldiers will get medical care and will ultimately survive the war. If you have a lot of casualties and you decide to fight, then everyone dies together pointlessly. I think the Russians have made that point. I think that point has sunk in with the average Ukrainian unit. So I think we'll see more surrenders, and at the same time, more units simply leaving the battlefield because they can't stay without dying.
Yeah, I don't like to be macabre, but I saw a video by Russia when they took over a certain forest line near Berdichi in this same sector that Alex was showing there a second ago. And it was really gut wrenching to have to look at. And I couldn't watch the whole thing, but one thing that really did stand out to me was two things, actually. One was that the enemy, I'm sorry, the Ukrainian side had dug very poor defensive positions. So they clearly had not had much time to prepare. But the other thing is that there was a large number of troops that had been casualties there. And you could see that some of them looked like that they had just died. Some of them looked like they had been there for a little while. Some looked like they had been there for a long time. And that kind of really, in my mind, justified what you have said several times, is that the Ukraine can't get their wounded soldiers out. So if they get wounded, they all usually die in place on the battlefield.
Now, the other thing is, strategically, the smart move back a year and a half ago was to consolidate its strength along this defensive line and begin building subsequent defensive lines, because inevitably they knew the Russians would have to attack and drive them out. Unfortunately, they decided to attack, and in doing so, they weakened themselves unnecessarily. I mean, this sort of thing, this movie is one that history has shown previously. In early March of 1943, in a meeting with his top generals on the Eastern Front, you had a number of key figures like Guderian and Oliver Speer wasn't there, but his representatives were, and Milch from the Luftwaffe, all trying to persuade Hitler and the top generals. This is in early March 1943, a month after the surrender of Stalingrad, that it was time to fall back and to build subsequent lines of defense and stop attacking, go over to a strategic defense and let the Russians or the Soviets at that point expend themselves. That would have worked very, very well. Unfortunately, they didn't do it. And they went down the same road in Ukraine this time. So I don't think there's much left, Dan. This tragedy is almost over, and sending more money and arms isn't going to change the outcome at this point.
Now, how might it play out if it almost seems like if Russia's doing a shaping operation or a preparation in the eastern part here, but they're standing up something larger in the north, the question is going to be, will Ukraine have enough soldiers to actually handle two big operations like that? And might they even fall apart before this offensive start? Because it seems like it just feels like, and I may be wrong, but it feels like the cracks are getting close to breaking through.
No, I think you're right. I think the breakthroughs have already occurred at numerous points. They simply haven't been exploited. But remember, there's also been the problem with the ground. It's been very moist. The ground is now firming up. It's drying out. So I would expect that by the middle of May, late May, you'll see massive movement of Russian forces forward. Now, the question is, how far do they go? And I've always said they will definitely go to the Dnieper River. And that's largely because no one will negotiate with them. And as long as there's no willingness to talk to the Russians about finding a way to end this, they will continue to advance. And by the time they're through, it's anyone's guess how much terrain they will control. But as I've said before, I've always believed they would eventually control Odessa as well as Kharkov. So that means you've got to control the Dnieper River in order to use those bridges. And if there's no government in Kiev to negotiate with, then I suppose they have to consider crossing and moving right into Kiev. Now, of course, you've got the French right now who've supposedly going to send troops, and they've already sent a few, 7 of whom have been killed already in the neighborhood of Slovyansk, as I understand it. I think anybody that goes into Ukraine at this point is dead meat. We in the West don't have the force strength. We don't have the right mix of capabilities. The only thing we can do is contribute to the graveyard over there.
Well, and that kind of brings me up to the next question I want to ask is, given the developments on the battlefield that Alex depicted, that you have talked about here, that you've warned about what's coming in the north, it seems like that there's a huge disconnect here with what the West is doing. From my perspective, the only rational point at this time for the West would be to acknowledge that this didn't work, that 2 years of time has been wasted, but that it's the course of action that makes any sense is to shut this down, to stop the bleeding, and to even build up the eastern flank of NATO. But instead, it's like there is no connection. There is no strategy. And in fact, this here by Lord Cameron, the foreign minister for UK, really kind of illustrates the disconnect.
In terms of what the Ukrainians do, in our view, it is their decision about how to use these weapons. They're defending their country. They were illegally invaded by Putin, and they must take those steps. We don't discuss any caveats that we put on those things, but let's be absolutely clear. Russia has launched an attack into Ukraine, and Ukraine absolutely has the right to strike back at Russia.
Now, Doug, why in the world at this late stage would the West be saying, hey, you can now strike into Russia proper, which can only exacerbate and annoy Russia, but it can't change anything on the battlefield? Why would they risk that?
On one level, remember, these are people that have made ridiculous statements on policy from which they cannot retreat. I mean, if you've said that everything depends on what we're doing, and if we fail, the world is lost, then what do? You say desperate measures are justified, and you don't admit defeat until it becomes inescapable. We did that in Vietnam. If you go back and listen to the comments that were made in 1965, 66, 67, 68, the South Vietnamese fight is our fight. Nonsense. Not our fight at all. In fact, everybody was trying to figure out what we were doing there to begin with. And secondly, if they fail, then they march on us and we'll have them in Los Angeles. It's the same sort of nonsense. Every decision that we have made in connection with the Russians, with this administration, has been impulse driven. No thinking, just emotion. And everyone gets together as a group. They have a huddle and then they emote. Oh, how terrible the Russians are. And we are on morally righteous ground. In the meantime, the Ukrainian nation is utterly destroyed. There are over 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers now. I don't know how many more casualties, certainly at least 1 million or more. Millions of Ukrainians have left. They're still trying to get out. The Ukrainian nation is on the ropes, but that doesn't matter because it's the morally right thing to do. Remember, that's what McGeorge Bundy wrote to McNamara in 1965. He said, well, if we go into Vietnam, we probably won't win, but it's the morally right thing to do. We'll explain that to the dead, to the families that lose husbands and sons and God knows what else. There's nothing morally righteous about dying in a hopeless cause, particularly
Absolutely.
when the hopeless cause is the wrong cause. And that's the case in Ukraine. This government is anything but what we describe it as being. There's nothing democratic about it. So it's worse than authoritarian. It resembles Stalin's state, if anything.
Yeah, there's not a lot of recognition of that, although there's certainly some truth to it. Actually, a lot of truth to it. But
by the
here's
way, before we move on,
Yeah.
I'm sure you're aware that the so-called debt holders for Ukraine, like BlackRock and others, are beginning to stir and saying we have to be paid back. I think the external debt is in the neighborhood of 161 or 171 billion dollars. Of course, the Ukrainians have nothing with which to pay it. They want debt forgiveness, and then they want to resume paying debts at some point in the future. And this is where the real danger comes in my judgment, is that these vulture capitalists like BlackRock will demand payment in kind. In other words, if you're not going to give us cash, then give us control of your territory. We want chunks of your rich farmland. We want to control what's there that belongs to you. Now it belongs to us. So this Ukrainian regime is besieged on all sides. It has no chance whatsoever.
And it could get worse because in light of what Lord Cameron has said there, Russia's not sitting back passively. In fact, they responded. Yeah, if you could throw up that headline here, this is from earlier today. The Russian military, the Russian government has warned the British ambassador that there will be a response if what Cameron said there over the weekend turns out to be true. If British missiles actually strike territory in Russia and destroy anything in there, Russia is saying today that they will respond in kind and not necessarily only in Ukraine. So opening up the possibility that this war could expand if they make good on that. And, that's been the concern from the beginning. And for a pretty good while, I thought, okay, well, it seems contained. We can keep it within Russia. But now it's like the West has taken actions that want to expand it. And I don't get that.
I think some time ago, you talked about the conditions today reflecting the conditions that existed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that was a very logical and real comment that people should have taken more seriously. We didn't care if the missiles that were in Cuba were fired by Cubans. They were still Russian missiles. Then, of course, we detected there were Russian forces on the ground prepared to execute the mission because obviously the Cubans weren't trained up to do it. And then we made it clear that this would spread, that if you're going to do this to us, then we will take action as we see fit elsewhere. The same thing holds true today for Moscow. Every day that passes, I'm astonished at the patience that President Putin and his government has exercised with regard to our, provocative stupidity. At some point, this is going to end. And I think the British are very foolish. Sometimes I think they believe it's really 1854 and it's the Crimean War. They don't understand that things have changed radically. And Britain is actually an afterthought militarily for the Russians. And if they're stupid and they persist and Russians are killed, then I would look out for attacks on British citizens. And if they think that NATO collectively is going to rise up as one and march off righteously to war that will inevitably escalate to the nuclear level, I think they've lost their minds.
Well,
I don't see readiness anywhere to send troops anywhere to do anything. I mean, that's Macron's argument for French troops. He says, no one will send anything, so we French have to do it.
Which doesn't, because they're not ready to fight. By the way, even the French have said that they could send a handful of troops mainly only, but it's not going to be decisive. And their French industry is even further behind than that. But going back to your point there about the nuclear risk here, it's going up again because this is, again, just today, Russia announces a non-strategic nuclear exercise, which they say is in direct response to what's going on. Gary, if you could throw that call up there. This is what the article says. The purpose of the exercise is to maintain the readiness and personnel and equipment of the non-strategic nuclear weapons, which that's what they call tactical nuclear weapons, to respond and ensure the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the state. It is noted this is a response to provocative statements and threats by certain Western officials against Russia. So these things are not going without now physical action where Russia's taken up step. Now, I want to play something here from Putin that he said early in the war, I think it was February of 2022, or maybe even just before, but right about the time this started, he's kind of laying a marker here about where his position is on what happens if external actors start coming in.
Очень важных слов для тех, у кого может возникнуть соблазн со стороны вмешаться в происходящие события. Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались. Мы готовы к любому развитию событий. Все необходимые в этой связи решения приняты. Надеюсь, что я буду.
Now, that was actually on the second day of the war that Putin said that. And it caused a lot of people in the West to kind of back off a little bit. But then they slowly started just kind of putting a toe on the rudder, cost this, that red line, that red line. First it was artillery pieces, then it was tanks, then it was APCs and Patriots, and, now then Storm Shadow missiles, now ATACMS. So everybody keeps crossing each line. They're going, okay, well, he doesn't mean it. But does he not mean it, Doug?
Yes, he very definitely does. And at this point in time, it would be especially ludicrous and self-defeating for the United States to test Russian will and resolve. They've been successful. They already hold 90% of what they're interested in. And there's nothing we can do to stop them from making it 100% of what they want, which again is this sort of crescent that runs from Kharkov down to Odessa. Now, if we suddenly said enough's enough, we understand and we're prepared to sit down and talk to you, I think they would meet with us. But they're the ones that'll do the talking, and we're going to have to do the listening, which is something we don't like and are not accustomed to do. But they're on the winning side, and we are not. So I think, yes, we should take him very seriously, and especially in light of something else you and I were discussing earlier, and that is sudden appearance of F-16s that are capable of delivering a nuclear payload showing up in Ukrainian airspace.
Yeah. In fact, if Gary, if we could throw that tweet up on the screen there, this was just out a little while ago. Actually, the Russian Foreign Ministry has said they would consider F-16s in Ukraine as carriers of nuclear weapons. They left unspecified what that would mean and what kind of action they would take. But given these now exercises where they're putting those things on, gives an ominous possibility of what that means. We'll see again if they take action on that. But here's the compounding problem for the West, Doug. What you just said is the rational path. That's what we should be doing, is recognizing this is not going anywhere and seeking a negotiated settlement on the best terms that we could get. That would preserve our interest, and it would actually, ironically, even help out the Ukraine side, because otherwise they're going to probably end up being much more harmed than they have so far. But instead, here is the fiction that the West continues to spread to try and keep everything going. Here's what Lindsey Graham said a little while ago, but well, check this out first.
If you give Putin Ukraine, he will not stop. This is not about containing NATO. And if you give him Ukraine, there goes Taiwan, because China's watching to see what we do.
Now, you might be, and you are, I can see from your reaction, well, he's just a clown. Nobody listens to him. Here's why it gets a little bit worse. Last night on 60 Minutes, the leader of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries, went on there and made some similar kinds of starts. And very seriously, this is according to the CBS News, is the Hakeem Jeffries, United States continues to support Ukraine to prevent a broader war, and he blamed the delay in aiding the fight in Russia on, quote, pro-Putin faction of the Republican Party. And then he says, Hakeem says, we can't let Ukraine fall, because if it does, there is a significant likelihood that America will get into the conflict. And you see it continues to go on from there. But that idea is just absurd to me. But you can't laugh this guy off, because, he's the leader of the Democratic Party. And of course, there's a Democratic president in the White House. So we have to worry, do they actually believe this? And that's what I worry about, Doug. Maybe he really believes this, and he's that disconnected from reality.
I think disconnected from reality is a perfect explanation. But unfortunately, neither of these men really know what they're talking about. They have no idea what's right and what isn't. I mean, these people have listened to the nonsense for so long that has come to them from their donors that they couldn't possibly consider any alternative. If your donor, the man or men or women that fill up your reelection campaign coffers, tells you this is our position and we want to back you, we'll support you, but push this to the hilt, that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to push it to the hilt. Now, historically, we've usually had a president in the White House who is sufficiently sober-minded that he could put the brakes on people like this. We don't have that. It is indeed the uniparty, and it's donor-occupied territory, and the donors are essentially making policy. Everybody knows if you want to be perpetually in office, you've got to go along with what the donors want. The possibility that this could lead to all-out war with Russia and result in God knows how many Americans being killed in pointless conflict with Russia that's not actually our enemy, I don't know. I mean, if it goes to the nuclear level, we know that in the first hour of a nuclear exchange with Russia, we are likely to lose 90 million dead. Now, I'm sure the Russians would face something equally awful, which is why Putin keeps saying, we don't want Armageddon. And I don't think they do, because he knows that Russia will lose. But of course, his comment is, in contrast to you, we will go as martyrs to heaven. Well, God bless him. Maybe he will, but I don't think anybody's going to be very happy about leaving the planet Earth in a nuclear holocaust. And they tend to dismiss that as something that's impossible. But yet, with each passing day, we do things that make it more and more plausible.
Well, and just to reinforce that point, again, when I even say the name, I know you're probably going to roll your eyes like most of us do, but Ben Hodges actually says we should take this a step further, not just give them F-16s, but let him speak.
You know, we had U.S. pilots and Royal Air Force pilots flying in support of Israel to help defeat this Iranian missile attack a couple of weeks ago. Israel has the best air defenses in the world. I mean, if it was important enough for the U.S. to contribute to that, why are we not helping Ukraine protect its civilian population? And Ukraine does not have the best air defenses in the world. So I think this is something that I would absolutely support.
Doug, this was a 3-star general in command of all U.S. forces in Europe when he was on active duty, and he can't see the difference between Iran and a nuclear-powered Russia that we should send fighter pilots. He actually made that argument.
Well, ignorance and, frankly, foolishness are no bar to advancement in uniform. So the fact that the man was advanced to 3 stars doesn't tell you anything other than he was voted into the club by other club members who decided he was a good get-along, go-along guy, which he is. And he knows it's his job to run around and push this war for a whole range of reasons that have nothing to do with reality or the national interest. That's another topic for discussion. But he does make one valid point. Why are we doing what we're doing for 6 million Jews in Israel, but we're not prepared to do the same thing for whatever still remains in Ukraine, 20, 24 million, 22 million, 19 million Ukrainians? And I think that's something that is worthy of exploration, because to be blunt, the stakes are no less high in the Middle East than they are in Ukraine. And if we do something stupid in the Middle East, vis-a-vis Iran, I would expect Russia to be involved. I would expect the Turks to come in, and the Chinese, of course, will back them all. The same thing is true in Ukraine. And I think one of the reasons that Premier or President Xi of China is currently in Europe, traveling to, I think he's headed to Serbia now, or perhaps Greece. He was in Paris recently. He's there trying to talk sense into people and say this is something that needs to be localized and ended on the best terms that we can get. We need to put an end to this. This is destructive, and it's unnecessary for us to go to war over it. I happen to agree with him. You know, the damage that's been done is really our fault. We could have stopped this thing at the end of March, beginning of April in 2022. We chose not to do it. So, you know, the Ukrainian nation is now a corpse. A while ago, it was on life support. I think it's pretty much dead at this point. And we are the principal murderers, not the Russians. Yeah. The Russians have done what you would have expected them to do, has done what we would have done had we faced a similar threat on our border. So at this stage, there's not much to say about Lindsey Graham and Hakeem Jeffries. And by the way, they're not unique. Very few people on the Hill are familiar with the realities, strategic realities in any number of different places in the world. And they fail to understand that at some point, things return to a natural state once we leave. We've never come to terms with that. We are always temporary wherever we go. We have a temporary influence. We do not permanently, fundamentally alter the landscape. And that's the problem in Ukraine. We've caused a lot of damage. We ought to apologize and get out.
Yeah. I wonder if you can touch on one other issue. The other day, Jack Keane was saying that there's a lot of things that we should do regarding to Crimea. I've got a clip here to show you what Hodges said about that. But I wonder if you can tell me what alarms you about this when you hear people talking like this.
Putin has put his personal prestige on Crimea. I mean, they have celebrated that. And so it would be a significant blow to the Russian side. It will be a significant blow to the Russian side when they are finally ejected from that place. That big bridge, that thing is going to drop at some point, not with ATACMS, but I think Ukrainians will have a plan that will bring that bridge down, make it unusable as part of the isolation of the Crimean Peninsula.
When you hear people talking about Russians out of the Crimea, that's even worse, I think, than claiming that you want to drive them out of the Donbass. That's a separate issue, or that can also be discussed. But what is it about the Crimea that concerns you when you hear people talking about trying to drive Russia out?
Notice that he personalizes the discussion and talks exclusively about Putin's prestige, Putin's interests, Putin's reputation. We don't understand that this is not a war that Putin made. The Russian people stand behind Vladimir Putin, and they are infinitely more supportive of him than the American people are supportive of President Biden. Those are the facts. Crimea has been Russian since 1776. Retaking it as he did was something that resonated strongly with Russians all over the country. And nothing is going to drive them out. So he's lost his marbles if he thinks that destroying part of the bridge or dismembering it for a brief period of time is going to make any difference. They've been trying to do this for years. It's not going to stop the war. It's not going to change the war. It will, if anything, it'll just mobilize the Russian people. I mean, right now, there are large numbers of Russians who are frustrated that Ukraine continues to exist. They think that the place should be subjected to a steamroller and just go across, wipe it out, and be done with it, so it's no longer a problem. President Putin has resisted this. He doesn't want that. He knows that's antithetical to their interests as well as to the people of Ukraine. He wants to return to some semblance of normalcy in Russia's relationship with Ukraine. And that means an end to the conflict. But unfortunately, we're not yet listening. We're busy preening ourselves in public. This is all macho talk that leads nowhere but to more destruction and chaos. And if they're not careful, it will lead to war between us and Russia. And if it stays conventional for any length of time, we will lose it. And if it goes to the nuclear level for any reason, we will all lose.
Yeah. Nobody will win then. Well, so given all of that, Doug, what do you think that we should do? And if you were advising the president today, or even the West, the NATO alliance for that matter, how would you advise them to do what you've suggested already, which is bring this to an end, but maintain some amount of credibility, if that's the right word, on our interests elsewhere, so that we don't, quote, look like we surrendered or whatever, but still maintain some kind of How can you thread that needle to give in to reality and do what makes sense while still maintaining strength?
Well, keep in mind, that's what we tried to do on our way out of Vietnam. I don't think the facade that we created of Vietnamization ultimately worked as well as we'd hoped. And when push came to shove, we had promised the Vietnamese that we would come back in with air power and support them. We didn't. Everything fell apart. I can't conceive of a situation worse than the one in Vietnam. Now, when you go to Ukraine, there has to be an admission that what we've done is a failure, that the policy is a failure. That means you have to change the policy, and Lord Salisbury, brilliant British Prime Minister in 1900, used to say the worst mistake in politics is to cling to the carcass of dead policies. Well, that's what we do. Our policy's dead. It has no chance for success. There's nothing we can do to reverse this. So why not end it? Well, it's back to, I said the following 2 years ago, because I said it 2 years ago, we can't change anything. Therefore, another 50,000, 100,000 Ukrainians need to die, and the country needs to be totally devastated, all to make it look as though I was serious and because I don't want to admit that I was wrong. This is utter nonsense, but that's where we are. So the first thing we've got to do is stop all military aid to Ukraine immediately. That is a serious signal that the Russians will see as evidence for a real interest in ending the war. You can't continue to fund their opponent and supply their opponent and expect the Russians to take us seriously. So that's number one. And in addition to us ending support, the Europeans need to end support. I'm talking about military support. We can continue humanitarian aid and support, and I hope that we do. And I think the Europeans should do that as well. Then proceed to a request for a ceasefire and see what kind of a response you get. And at that point, it's all up to the Russians. And bear in mind that we're not in a position to dictate to the Russians. This is their country. They've won. We're foreigners. We lost. We have to come to that realization. The sooner we do it, the better off Ukraine will be and the better off we will be, because we seem to be working hard to cultivate a regional war down in the Middle East. And if that's not enough, we seem determined to provoke the Chinese over Taiwan. It's insane.
Yeah, it makes no sense at all. Well, we'll see how this ends up playing out. We're certainly going to continue to track this very tightly. Before I let you go here, I want to talk about something different, which I hope doesn't become related, and that is the United States Army is looking to modernize its forces, and it's talking about how it's going to plan the next big war. There's this article here in the Army Times where it's talking about that we now recognize that the era of the counterinsurgency is over and the era of the new big war again is back on tap. And the authors in here write that the Army sees its role as providing a major ground combat power for large-scale operations. To do that, they will have to fight with divisions and corps, which range from 12 to 45,000 soldiers respectively. These formations' headquarters units will orchestrate the battle, striking deep with long-range fires, attack aircraft, and hooking into joint capabilities from the Air Force, Navy, and Marines. Now, I know you have some views on this, on the modernization of forces, and I wonder what your view is on almost going back to Army divisions and corps. And based on all the stuff that we've seen here in this Russia-Ukraine war, does that make sense?
No. First of all, there will be no repetition of the Normandy landing anytime in the future. We are not going to cross oceans with millions of men, deliver them on the Eurasian continent, and march into somebody else's country. So that needs to be jettisoned right off the bat. That is an entirely new game. Once you recognize that that's not going to happen, then you have to build for very different things. We don't have the capability or the will to send millions of soldiers somewhere else to fight, nor should we try. We'll never get across the Pacific or the Atlantic. Precision strike from the sea, from the air, space-based surveillance and reconnaissance, intelligence surveillance will all track us, target us, and sink us. So those days are over. So what are you building for? Well, I think you need to build for a force that meets your national security requirements. Going back to the World War II paradigm, which has always been the preferred paradigm because it provides lots of career jobs and for generals and colonels. That's why we have 43 4-stars on active duty right now, instead of probably 10, which would be the most we actually need. We have too many headquarters, too many regional unified commands, too many functional and subordinate commands, too many 4-stars, 3-stars all over the place. It's just insanity. But this is the product of the Cold War and the period immediately after the Cold War, when politicians were cultivating support inside the military. And how do you do that? You promote people. Reagan became enormously popular in the Department of Defense in the 1980s when he said, well, let's elevate the rank of all the members of the armed forces who are serving in the staffs of the Pentagon. So if you were a principal on the Army staff, Navy staff, Marine staff, Air Force staff, normally you were a 2-star. Well, Reagan changed it, made them all 3-stars. So I love Reagan. That's wonderful. That was a very dumb thing to do, but that made him very popular and everybody cheered. Politicians don't understand the consequences of their actions. They don't understand how important organizational design is. They don't understand the importance of identifying our limitations in terms of what we can or cannot do as a society. Because if you began to do that, you'd have to also look at limitations on your interests. You know, if somebody once asked me, well, you don't want to fight the Chinese in the South China Sea or anywhere else as far as I could turn. So if you have to fight the Chinese, where do you want to fight them? I said, well, from the standpoint of the United States, the best place to meet the Chinese is in the middle of the Pacific, where we have an enormous advantage at sea, in the air, in space. Let them sail out into the middle of it and try to reach us, and we'll sink them. They'll never get there.
Right.
Well, I don't understand. You know, it's this sort of stupidity. You know, well, if we don't stop the Chinese on the borders of Vietnam, they'll march all the way to such and such. Well, fine, let them try. You know, there's such a thing as overextending yourself. We forget that overextension is what brings most great powers to their knees.
Okay, and speaking of overextension, here's a great example of it from the President Biden himself.
We don't walk away from our allies. We stand with them. We don't let tyrants win. We oppose them. We don't merely watch global events unfold, we shape them. That's what it means to be the indispensable nation. That's what it means to be the world's superpower and the world's leading democracy. But this vote makes it clear there is a bipartisan consensus for that kind of American leadership. That's exactly what we'll continue to deliver.
You know, Doug, I remember in this book that you wrote here, Margin of Victory, where you talk about a lot of wars and how they were fought and what the margin of victory was and what led to it. The thing that always stood out to me, or one of the things about that, was that you said it basically takes the decade before the war starts is when the decisive thing was decided, basically. And so when you hear the president talking like this, and he's not unique. I mean, this president's going back decades, keeps saying that same kind of stuff. And you see that the Army is now looking to go almost backwards or so. What should the Army do right now in terms of getting ready for a next fight, which doesn't seem it's going on, but also simultaneously to that, it seems like it's the wise thing to do if what you're saying in this book is true, and it takes that much time to really get the force ready for combat, that the U.S. government should start having an appetite suppressant and start backing off from some of these things to give time for the military to actually get ready.
Well, you have to get out of the business of reenacting World War II over and over and over again. You have to recognize that those solutions, divisions, corps, armies consisting of hundreds of thousands of troops, is the wrong solution for the future, because we're not going to do that. If we put that kind of force on the ground, assuming it ever got across the Atlantic or the Pacific, it would make easy pickings for precision strike. It's exactly what you're seeing happen in Ukraine. We're not prepared for that. So we need to scale back some of our goals and objectives, start talking about hemispheric defense. What are we going to do to defend the United States? No one seems to be interested in defending our borders, so we're being invaded from the south. Well, I think it's time for us to regain control of our borders if we expect to exist as a nation in the future at all. And that needs to happen immediately. And then the Army needs to be responsible for homeland defense, which is what it has done historically. But we also need to go back and look at all of the armed forces, because they need to integrate their capabilities much more effectively than they do today. This means a complete reorganization or overhaul of the Department of Defense. This, of course, is the thing that nobody wants in Washington, because the existing equipment lines, the existing structures, the 43 four-stars and their headquarters and interests, these things support endless defense spending on a scale that is unnecessary and ultimately detracts from our prosperity. You know, Eisenhower said the American people deserve national security, and they also deserve prosperity. He says it's our job to give them both. And boy, there were lots of people in the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and the Marines that hated Dwight Eisenhower because he absolutely refused to indulge the bloating of these services and their headquarters. He knew how the system worked. He said, forget it, I'm not going to do it. We haven't had anybody with that kind of understanding and strength in the White House in the last 60, 70 years, and we desperately need someone like that now. We have to put an end to this nonsense, an end to the fantasies. You know, we're not going to sit on Taiwan and prevent the Chinese from seizing it. First of all, China may not be interested in seizing it, and the Taiwanese don't necessarily want to fight the Chinese, and we may see a very peaceful unification in the near future. People don't understand what's really happening on the ground. But think of the stupidity of isolating your forces there. We went through this at Manila in 1942. You know, the whole plan for war in the Pacific involved the use of the entire United States Navy to cross the Pacific with 2 divisions of U.S. troops and relieve our troops in the Philippines. Everybody, including MacArthur and Nimitz and everyone who took over, knew that was an impossibility. And what happened to us? We put up a tremendous fight, not something like what happened in Singapore with Percival and the Brits. That was a disgrace. He just turned all those poor men over to the Japanese, and the rest of it is history. But with us, we fought tenaciously. We still ended up with 12,000 men and women who were nurses marched to,
Bataan Death Camp,
to these camps where they were treated like animals. should never have happened. We can't do these things. We cannot put large numbers of forces on islands and penny packets. This is the problem in the Middle East right now. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. And everybody says, well, it's worked so far and we can go and punish those guys with air power. The real capabilities haven't been employed.
Right.
People really don't want to go to war with us. But if we provoke and we push and we insist, we'll get what we don't want. And then we will end our role in this world as a great power. We will recede back into the Western Hemisphere, and we will do it in a state of weakness. Weakness always invites attack, and we will have trouble defending ourselves. That happened to the Spanish. It's happened to the British. We're following the same stupid path to disaster.
Indeed, we are, and it's so anguishing to watch. And Duncan, just in the last few minutes we have here, I wanted if you could talk about really the bill payers for this insanity. So if we actually get into any of these unnecessary wars, whether in the Middle East, if we get dragged into there, or in, God forbid, into Russia, and we end up or China, over Taiwan, if we end up doing something so stupid, the people who are going to pay are our soldiers, our veterans, the people who are serving, who are supposed to be signing up to defend our country, but will instead, like many of the Ukraine soldiers, be sent to die in pointless battles. And I know in your country, company there, Our Country, Our Choice, you guys are really doing a lot for the veterans. And I wonder if you could just talk about how important that is to you.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that large numbers of people have decided not to serve in the armed forces anymore. And I run into friends, family friends, people I served with in the military. Some of them are West Point classmates. And they tell me that they're telling their sons, their grandsons, don't do this. Don't sign up for this. What's the point? Your life will be wasted. And then these young men in particular look at what's happening with this diversity, inclusion, equity nonsense. They say, why should I bother? There's no meritocracy any longer. Everything is based on your racial, gender preferences or identities, many of which are not even real. And they say, this is absurd. Why should I bother? So you've got a huge problem with recruiting and maintaining the force as it is. So to talk about hundreds of thousands of troops and divisions and corps, that's all crap. It's just silly nonsense. We can't maintain what we have today. We're overstretched. It's very much like the British Empire at the end of World War II. And it was always interesting to me where you heard Churchill in 1939 say something along the lines of, or I guess it was 40, if the British Empire should last 1,000 years, let everybody know this will be our finest moment. Well, it wasn't. It was the end of the British Empire because they lost sight of the first strategic imperative. And your number one strategic imperative is always the same: survival of the state and its population. That comes first. That means our standard of living, our way of life, our government, our rights here at home, our property, our economy. Everything must come first. It has been abused. If anything, it's being held in contempt by a ruling class in Washington that seems to think its destiny is to rule the world. It's absurd.
Yeah, and I just I don't want to see us repeat that history, and I don't want to see us pay the price in blood for going down this path. But it's hard to keep a lot of optimism for that when I see some of these quotes that we've played for you here today. But if nothing else, we keep hoping that with shows like this and with comments like you make, that we'll spread this out there so people hear the truth and can see through a lot of the BS that's being thrown in our way, so that maybe enough people can make their voices heard that can prevent some of this stuff, because our politicians still do listen to the voice of the people if it gets too loud and they start getting in the way. And let's hope that continues on. But in any case, thank you so much for coming on today, Doug, and giving us a lot of insight onto these really, really vital matters.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it.
And we thank you guys for coming on to watching us. We always value you. We are going to remain unintimidated and uncompromised to keep bringing you the truth, no matter what it is. And we ask you to join us this afternoon. We're going to have Tulsi Gabbard on our show, who's just published a book for love of country. And then many of the things you're going to hear her say today, you'd think it comes straight off of our channel here, because she agrees with many of the things that we do. And you'll not want to miss that. 3:30 Eastern time, Tulsi Gabbard. Thanks very much. And we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.